The examples that people usually cite of what was so strange about these books, themes of incest.
I'm one of the best investigative reporters I think in the world today.
So one of the most striking things about going back and reading the novels of V.C. Andrews as an adult is really fully being able to appreciate how completely unhinged and off the chain these books really were. Like a lot of women my age who grew up in the 80s, these books were pretty much required reading. These were the books that your friends passed around and giggled about with the pages with the dirty parts earmarked. Of course, these really classic covers would kind of feature a keyhole where you could see a portrait of usually the main character's face, who was usually some beautiful young girl who looked absolutely stricken or terrified. And then when you open the cover up, there was a portrait behind it. This was usually a very gothic-looking family portrait, kind of sinister, harsh-looking characters being depicted. Sometimes they would actually display scenes from the book. The absolutely terrifying portrait when you open up the cover of Petals on the Wind is one that really jumps to mind to me when I'm talking about this. These classic keyhole covers are the only way that these books should ever be read. Now, like everybody who read these books growing up, I found them really compelling, shocking, absorbing. I would tear through them. I couldn't wait to get to the next one. I don't know if some of it just went over my head. I was so busy empathizing with the main character and their suffering that sometimes I didn't really step back to take note of how completely insane these plot twists were. However, now reading them as an adult, I don't have the experience of devaluing them, of, oh God, in retrospect, this was horrible. In fact, rereading them really gives me a new sense of respect for V.C. Andrews. Her imagination was unparalleled. Yes, there are some really grotesque and really bizarre and really sordid things that happen in these stories. Some of them, and in some of them, yes, these books are absolutely off the rails. She almost created her own genre. I think one of the reasons why these books kind of instinctively resonated with people was because there were some familiar undertones to them. They were gothic, a little bit horror novel, a little bit fairy tale. They're really hard to categorize in a genre. Like a lot of young girls at that time who found these books, I had no idea that what I was reading was something that could potentially be considered kind of trashy. In fact, at the time, I think I really thought I was reading great literature. Really long, really thick, had all the hallmarks of great literature. They were really thick. They had kind of a Charles Dickens with their young people in torment. I really thought I was reading something akin to Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. I was trying to tell my mother how much I loved them, so I was kind of describing the plot of one of the books. I think with the way that I was describing the book, she had a much different impression of what this book was really like. I had kind of left one sitting on the kitchen table, and so while I was there, she picked it up and started skimming through it because I think I had kind of piqued her interest in it. And she happened to open it up to some really graphic, salacious entries in the book. And my mother, as I think a parent of an 11-year-old who was reading one of these books should have been, was absolutely mortified and asking me how I could possibly be reading this trash. And then she read the passage out loud. Hearing her read it in this very kind of stern and shocked voice was really embarrassing. Really made me doubt myself as a reader. And I think I was more embarrassed by the fact I had thought these books were great. More so than the fact that I had gotten caught reading something kind of trashy. The examples that people usually cite of what was so strange about these books, themes of incest. So delving in a little bit, what we find in trying to research V.C. Andrews is that her life was very mysterious. There's also seemingly a lot of misreporting. Some of this has to do with conflicting statements that she made through the years, so some of it might have been a little bit intentional. Some of it seems to be some kind of urban legends that kind of sprung up around her and got connected to her official biography. She was a very private person, and she was very selective about what she shared with the press. She was also a little bit distrustful of giving interviews. In fact, one of the major interviews interviews that she gave during her lifetime with People magazine. It ended up being a situation that she felt very exploited by. She felt that the magazine had given inaccurate information, deliberately set out to make her sound a little bit weird. She even felt that they had intentionally picked the most unflattering picture of her that they could, but also kind of sensationalized her disability in a way that she was very offended by. After her death, her family and her publishers were trying to be a little bit furtive about the fact that she had passed away because they were continuing to publish novels under her name, written by a ghostwriter. At the time of her death, she was a wildly popular author. She was in the middle of writing 2 very popular book series. Although her death had been reported by most major news outlets, in the pre-internet information age, this wasn't necessarily something that landed with the public. Stories like this could kind of slip between the cracks. There was a great deal of investment in continuing to promote and sell books written under her name. It seems also it took a while for members of her family to really want to make public information about her life. But we do know B.C. Andrews was born Cleo Virginia Andrews in the town of Portsmouth, Virginia in 1923. She was the middle of 3 children and the only girl. Although she came from humble beginnings in a family that struggled somewhat financially, according to Virginia's relatives, she was really the apple of her parents' eye, and they spared no expense in indulging her. She always wore beautiful clothes, and interestingly, much like the characters that she would later write about, her family really describes her as being like a little fairy princess. Beautiful child, blonde hair, violet eyes. She's a very beautiful and very dainty little girl. She also showed a very early intelligence and artistic ability. In fact, according to stories that Virginia told people later in life, at the age of 7, her elementary school teacher was so impressed with her artistic ability that she had Virginia enroll in a community college art class for adults. She would sit on a dictionary so that she could see the board. And in the Andrew Niederman biography about her, The Woman Behind the Attic, he shares a story that Virginia told people about being a child and having Frank Lloyd Wright come to her class. He had instructed everybody to draw pictures of houses, and she drew a circular house with no windows, with all glass walls. Frank Lloyd Wright was kind of walking through the aisles looking at what people were drawing, and when he came to hers and saw that, he was curious about the all glass walls, so he asked her why she had chosen to do that. And at that point she said, well, I was thinking about my mother, who's always complaining that there are never enough windows. According to the lore that Virginia told people in later years, at that point, the great Frank Lloyd Wright looked at her teacher and said, a child like this absolutely terrifies me. Virginia's imagination was terrifying people from a very young age. Even the likes of Frank Lloyd Wright. Her family moved to Rochester, New York, which is where she spent her early years. Now, it was during Virginia's teenage years where tragedy struck. Things took a life-altering turn for her that left her confined to the use of a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Now, exactly what led to this is a little bit unclear. There are some conflicting stories. For many years, the canon, most widely believed story was that Virginia had suffered a tragic fall down a flight of stairs when she was in high school that had led to an injury that left her permanently unable to walk. And it appears that even Virginia herself may have at various points given this impression to people. I think that the belief in this as being the official story was probably also reinforced by serious falls down flights of stairs that led to tragic consequences was a major plot point more than once in her novel, My Sweet Audrina. What's interesting about B.C. Andrews' work is that I think a lot of times there's a tendency for people to look for parallels of her own experience in her novel. There certainly are intersections between her life and her stories at different points. Now, what her family has said most likely caused her inability to walk had to do with a previous diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis that she'd already had for a few years at this point. As a result of whatever happened, Virginia was left unable to walk. She did have a couple of surgeries, but the way her family and people knew her describe it was that she was essentially unable to move her spine. She had very limited range of motion for the top half of her body. She did undergo several major surgeries at the University of Virginia. However, none of these surgeries was successful, and as a result, Virginia would have to use a wheelchair for the rest of her life. This would have been in the late 30s. So looking at the time frame when these events happened, this was a much different societal moment as far as how disabilities were looked at. Things were less inclusive. But really, the truly tragic thing about this, her family's response to her disability, and primarily her mother's response, was to pretty much cloister her away from the outside world. She did not return to high school for her senior year. She was essentially kept inside the house from that point on. And her mother did everything for her, such as buying clothing, doing her shopping, things like that. Her mother had a real concern about not wanting people to see her that way. In fact, in Andrew Niederman's book, shares a story told to him by members of the Andrews family that Virginia's mother would even deliberately position her behind trees when she was sitting on the front porch in her wheelchair because she didn't want anybody to see the wheelchair. So this was really treated like a stigma. Virginia's mother's idea at the time was that it was in Virginia's best interest to kind of be kept inside and protected from the outside world, to have her disability hidden from others, which led to Virginia having a very sheltered adulthood. Virginia's mother, Lillian Andrews, was very domineering, very controlling, had a lot of ideas about what was in Virginia's best interest, had a lot of anxieties about what would happen if Virginia had contact with the outside world. Virginia was in a position where she was completely dependent on her mother for care, and she wasn't in much of a position to push back. There's a cousin who Andrew Niederman talked to in some length who shares a story. At one point, Virginia and her mother were living with this cousin. She became very close to Virginia and really felt like there was no reason for her to be so cloistered away from the outside world. She would try to set up activities and outings for the two of them to do together, like going to the mall or going out to eat, just things to allow Virginia to have a life outside of the house. And this was very upsetting to Virginia's mother, who was very unhappy with this and thought it was a danger. This cousin was, on a few occasions, able to override the mother. She took Virginia to a shoe store in the mall. Virginia was in her early 40s at this point, and she shared with her that this was the first time she'd been in a shoe store since she was 16 years old. Unfortunately, Virginia's mother eventually became so unhappy with the fact that this cousin was starting to kind of plan these activities for Virginia that the two of them ended up moving out. So Virginia's mother really had the ultimate control over her life during this point. Part of Virginia's official biography is that after her father died in 1957, she and her mother were in some financial straits at this point. Virginia did receive disability, but other than that, they had no steady stream of income at that time. It's sometimes purported that to help make ends meet, Virginia was a commercial artist, a fashion designer, an illustrator. But in trying to dissect these claims a little bit more, they seem to be largely untrue. In fact, Virginia herself gave an interview later in her life where she said that although she was very prolific in her artistic pursuit, she never actually really made any money off it. She had a particular kind of floral painting on velvet that she was doing at this point. So her mother had made some arrangements with a local department store to sell the paintings there. So it does seem from this that it is true that she may have sold some of these paintings, but it doesn't seem true that she ever had any other kind of commercial career as an artist. Now, by all accounts of her family during this time, Virginia was a very prolific painter. She had an entire room of art supplies. For many years, painting really was her outlet. The overall description that Virginia's family has of her during her adult years, how meticulous her makeup was, because she did have a lot of artistic talent. She could create some really striking, stunning looks for herself. She also designed and made most of her own clothing. She really had a penchant for these very feminine, very kind of elegant gowns, kind of feeling like a fairy princess locked in. Being so disconnected at that time from the outside world, and I think a lot of that really spilled across in her writing. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think a case could be made that her stories really are these kind of dark fairy tales, and I think we see a lot of her psyche in these stories in a really visceral way. She really leaned heavily into painting to have an outlet. So by Virginia's own admission, she started to drift away from painting and look for a new creative outlet. It was simply too cumbersome, too messy, too hard to do for her creative pursuit. And so at this point, she became interested in writing. Apparently, when she first began doing this, she wrote in secret quite a lot. Seemingly, the first manuscript she completed was a science fiction novel entitled The Gods of Green Mountain. Although this is the first full novel that she's believed to have completed, it remained unpublished until 2004 when it was released as an ebook. Now, in her pitch letter for her breakthrough novel, the classic Flowers in the Attic, she shared that she had previously written 3 Gothic romance novels and various stories in confessional-type pulp magazines under pen names and without the help of an agent. People have looked and tried to dig these up, but nothing's ever really been found. In the late 70s, V.C. Andrews sent her first draft of the manuscript for Flowers in the Attic to an up-and-coming young editor in her 20s named Ann Patty at Pocket Publishing. Flowers in the Attic was Ann's first editorial assignment. She reports reading this book for the first time and absolutely knowing that she had something unique in her hands. She recounted staying up all night reading it, finding it really absorbing. However, by her admission, the first draft of the novel was less than 100 pages long, and in her words, lacked spice. So she sent it back to Virginia, asked her if she could expand it and spice it up a little bit, and send it back. And boy, did she ever. For those who aren't familiar with this iconic work, Flowers in the Attic was the first book of V.C. Andrews' highly successful Dollinger series. This was a book series that ended up consisting of 5 books altogether. The novel is about the 4 Dollinger children, who are described as looking like a perfect set of dolls with beautiful flaxen blonde hair and big blue eyes. The Dollinger children consist of Christopher and Kathy, the older 2, who are 14 and 12 years old at the beginning of the book, and their younger twin siblings, Carrie and Corey, who are small children when the book opens. Up until the events of the first chapter of the book, Kathy and Christopher are described as having had a pretty idyllic life. The time frame for the events of the book is described as being back in the 50s. And in the opening chapter, we hear about the picture-perfect upbringing of Kathy and Christopher. Father Christopher Sr. is a doctor. Their mother, Corinne, is a beautiful housewife. Both Christopher Sr. and Corinne are described as being striking all-American blondes with chiseled good looks who are the envy of all their friends. And the 4 Dollinger children are described as kind of spitting images of the parents. They had been labeled the Dresden dolls by family friends because of their kind of perfect doll-like appearance. And so the Dollinger family is described as having a pretty comfortable, idyllic, upper-class suburban life until the terrible night that Christopher Sr. fails to make it home. Christopher Sr. dies in a car accident. Following the tragic death of the father, the family begins to fall into a state of financial disarray, with their mother, Corinne, who's never held a job before, having to face the fact that she's unable to financially support the family. Corinne calls her children to gather around one day and explains to them that due to their precarious financial state, they're going to have to return to the estate of her extremely wealthy parents, Foxworth Hall, which is the sprawling Gothic estate where her parents live. This is all news to the children. They've never met their grandparents before or heard their mother's backstory. The mother explains to them at this point that she has been estranged from her family for many years and disinherited from their wealth due to having mortified her incredibly religious parents by marrying her half-uncle. As a result of this, her parents cut her off years ago and disinherited her from their wealth. However, at this point, her father is very ill and believed to be on his deathbed. So she's written to her mother with a plea for help due to her crumbling financial situation. So what Corinne then explains to her children is that her plan is to return to Foxworth Hall, try to get back in the good graces of her father so she can get back in the will. The caveat here is that he does not know about her children, and because of his disapproval of her having married her half-uncle, if he were to find out about their existence, she would never be included in the will. So as a result of this, Corinne explains to the children that they're just going to need to stay hidden for just a little bit, for just a short period of time until their grandfather dies. So as the children are trying to sort of make sense of this crazy story, Corinne promises them that this will only be for a short period of time, and then they will have money. And so when the children get there and they're shown their private quarters, they also learn that in their quarters there's a doorway with a stairwell that leads to the attic. Due to their extremely tight quarters and their boredom and the necessity of having to stay hidden all day, the attic ends up being where they spend a lot of their time. The story begins to really take a sinister turn when they begin butting heads with their grandmother, who is a horrifying fanatical, who is an absolutely horrifying fanatical, who is an absolutely terrifying. She despises her own grandchildren and calls them the devil's spawn. And unfortunately, the grandmother is often the one that the children interact with the most. She comes to drop off food, but largely they're left alone all day to fend for themselves with just orders to be quiet. Initially, their mother comes and visits them frequently, brings them presents and art supplies and toys and things to entertain themselves with, frequently reassures them of her love and affection and promise that this terrible situation is only temporary. However, as time goes goes on, this begins to change. Corinne's visits become less frequent. When the children do see her, she's much less warm. As she becomes sort of reintroduced to high society and reaccustomed to the finer things in life again, living in the lap of luxury with her parents' mansion, her behavior begins to change. She begins to seem more vain, more greedy, more materialistic. Eventually, her visits just start to dwindle off, and they're left with only their abusive grandmother to interact with. This becomes a real story of imprisonment and trauma. The children are just kind of left alone to wither in the attic. One of the primary features of this book that everybody remembers is that there's also a subplot involving an incestuous relationship between the older siblings, Christopher and Kathy. And to be honest, it's pretty creepy, and it's pretty creepy, and it's pretty creepy, and it's pretty creepy. Another aspect of this sexual relationship between the two siblings is that their first encounter is essentially an assault. It gets pretty lurid, and this theme continues throughout the 5 books. In fact, spoiler alert, they end up getting married and raising a family together. It's a lot. But it really resonated with readers. This remains a massively popular novel. It was first released in 1979 as a paperback. V.C. Andrews at this point was in her 50s. This book took off like wildfire. V.C. Andrews became a runaway best-selling author. We were still kind of in the great heyday of the paperback novel. So this was when you would kind of have those circular racks of paperback, drugstores and airports. The intent here was to really grab on to the paperback reading audience with aspects of gothic and romance novels, but also entirely its own new thing. V.C. Andrews really created her own genre, and nobody's ever been able to replicate it. Not even the ghostwriter, which is really amazing for a book that V.C. Andrews later said she completed in 2 weeks, and to have made all the necessary modifications when it was sent back to her for revamping in 1 night. She reportedly did her writing at a stand-up desk, where she would stand for 10 to 12 hours a day typing. So she was extremely passionate about her writing, and people just absolutely ate it up. So as a result of this, the publishers were pretty anxious to get a sequel out. They really saw this as something that had great potential to be a book series. And because V.C. Andrews was such a prolific writer, she immediately had a sequel for them, Petals on the Wind, which followed the adventures of the children after their great escape. Twisted, tormented adventures. The twists and turns that book in particular and all the rest of the books in this series take are things that I just absolutely could not even attempt to do justice to. Grotesque and weird and shocking and horrifying and absolutely delicious. These books are the very definition of guilty pleasure. And they're so hard to describe. They're kind of campy, they're kind of trashy, kind of scary, kind of romance novels. They're kind of like these really dark, twisted fairy tales. V.C. Andrews' imagination was terrifying and dark and vivid, but really entertaining and wildly popular. And interestingly, I believe that the original intent was for them to be aimed at adult readers. I don't necessarily think that these were intended to be young adult books, but in a way it kind of became a young adult series. There was something about these books that really resonated with young readers. A lot of the tragic and catastrophic events that the main characters endure can really be seen as symbolic for the horrors of adolescence. Also, the sexual awakening of the characters in the book. I think in some ways these kinds of books had a very romance novel, kind of Harlequin romance novel type way of describing sex, while also providing a little bit of a window to kind of get a glimpse at sexuality from a safe distance. There were a lot of themes in these books that young people could identify with. Now, the books themselves, absolutely batshit. In addition to the Ballinger series, V.C. Andrews also wrote the Casteel series. The first 2 books, oh my god, I'm going to be honest, y'all, I'm really partial to the Casteel books. They're pretty nutty. There are some absolutely terrifying images and stories from those books. But I find the first 2 books in the series, the ones that V.C. Andrews actually wrote herself, Heaven and Dark Angel, to be absolutely fascinating. That I really love them. That I just love them. That I just love them. That I just love them. And then there was also a standalone book called My Sweet Audrina. Probably the most raucously insane, disturbing, toxic, gross, but wildly entertaining and incredibly readable book of all of V.C. Andrews. I feel like this, My Sweet Audrina, was really the book where she just kind of let her imagination run wild. It would need its own, not even just a video, but like 10-part series. I'm just going to leave it at, that book is something else. So with the publication of the first 4 Dollinger books, as well as the beginning of the Casteel series and the standalone My Sweet Audrina, V.C. Andrews became a wildly wealthy woman. In a very short period of time, she amassed a hugely loyal fan base, and in the course of just a few years went from a middle-aged woman who had been on disability her whole life into a millionaire. And in a lot of ways during these years, V.C. Andrews really made up for the confinement of the early years of her life. Because V.C. Andrews' life itself was so interesting, and her books are so colorful.
The silence is
I think
deafening.
people often look for parallels between the real VC and her stories. And she herself was always pretty open about the fact, particularly with the Flowers in the Attic books, the confinement and the oppression that Kathy felt in the attic was very much an expression of VC's own feelings of confinement. A lot of people speculate that the very domineering grandmother was kind of a reflection of Virginia's relationship with her own mother. She never said as much. She did dedicate the book to her mother, although her mother was always very vocal about the fact that she refused to read the books. She had heard enough about the plot to not want to read them. Her editor, Ann Patty, also shared an insight in later years that in a lot of ways she felt like V.C. Andrews was that 15-year-old girl she wrote about, because that was the age where her life drastically changed. Like Virginia's life had kind of gotten frozen in amber at that time. And there's also kind of a sad irony in the fact that for somebody who wrote such purple prose, Virginia herself never had a relationship with a man. She's actually reported as having asked younger family members and her doctor to describe sex to her in a very clinical way so that she could accurately represent it in her book. When Flowers in the Attic was turned into a Hollywood film, she got to go to Hollywood. She actually even had a cameo in the movie. Tragically, though, when Virginia was at the height of her newfound fame, she became ill. And this is another aspect of her biography that's a little bit murky and a little confusing. That's at some point around the mid-'80s, Virginia became aware of a lump in her breast. She had just begun to write the Casteel series. She was so consumed with writing the book that she put off getting treatment, telling people that she needed to finish these books first. It was also shared by a member of her family that because she was reticent to seek medical treatment, she was willing to seek some guidance from the Edgar Cayce Foundation in Virginia Beach. At this point, Virginia had bought a beautiful oceanfront estate home in Virginia Beach. With the Edgar Cayce Foundation nearby, she had sought help there in the hope that she may be able to find some kind of holistic treatment that wouldn't interfere with her writing. Unfortunately, she did not seek help in time. By the time that she was officially diagnosed with breast cancer, she was too far along. It's interesting that the Casteel series was the book she was working on during this time, because in the first book in that series, Heaven, there is a storyline involving the character Kitty, who it turns out later in the story is secretly suffering from breast cancer, but hasn't told anybody or sought treatment. So it's possible that in writing this book, this may have been a reflection of what Virginia was going through during that time. But it seems like it was largely something that she was extremely private about, and a lot of people just simply didn't know she was sick. Virginia passed away in December of 1986. Flowers in the Attic was published in 1979, and between the years of 1979 and 1986, although this was only a 7-year period of time, it was a time of incredible success for Virginia. She was living her life and being afforded opportunities that she never had before. So she had her truly remarkable final 7 years of her life. She was by this point a household name, and as such, her death was reported in all major news outlets. However, being the pre-internet, pre-information age, this seems to have been something that really slipped a lot of people's notice. Prior to her death, a decision had already been made by her publisher to seek a ghostwriter to continue to publish books under her name. Because at this point she was writing books in a series format, and these books were wildly successful. And honestly, it seems like the plan was just to try to keep this as under wraps as possible. Somehow the notices of her death really just seemed to slip a lot of people's attention. And so the publishers had found an author, Andrew Niederman, a fiction writer whose style they liked, who they felt could mimic, could do a good job of capturing V.C. Andrews' voice. So they had him finish up the final book in the Dollinger series and complete the last 3 books of the Casteel series. As far as most of the public seems to have been concerned, even even avid readers of hers, were under the impression that she was still alive, still writing these books herself. Another decision that the publishers had made at this point was to kind of come up with this narrative that at the time of V.C. Andrews' death, that she had already written the subsequent books in the series and left behind unpublished writing and notes for future books that she wanted to write. So the narrative that they were spinning was that she had written these books before her death, and they were being published posthumously with maybe just a little bit of editing or organizational help from a ghostwriter. But the truth was she'd left behind virtually nothing. These were all the brainchildren of the ghostwriter. But a couple of things happened that kind of outed what was going on to the public. One of these things had to do with the IRS. A tax auditor who had been working with the V.C. Andrews estate happened to be in a bookstore, saw a newly published book under her name that hadn't been part of the official estate, and so they became curious about this. When they learned that books needed to be published in her name, they went after the family for more tax monies. So this case got some attention and did kind of draw to light the fact that she was deceased. Another thing that happened was that the ghostwriter, he had begun to develop a new book series in her name. And so there was apparently a bidding war with the UK publisher, HarperCollins. And when they lost out, they were kind of bitter. So they kind of went public and they've outed the publisher by saying that this was a ghostwriter, implying that they felt that the publisher was doing something unethical by publishing these books under her name when they in fact had been written by a ghostwriter. And I think that he did his best. I think he tried to capture some of the same style, turns of phrase, tropes of V.C. Andrews. I feel a little watered down in retrospect. They just don't have that same wild, balls to the wall, anything goes kind of freewheeling feel of the real V.C. Andrews books. I think they're as good as they could have been being written by somebody else, but they're just not the same. The first book of the first series that he totally created himself, the book was called Dawn. Interestingly, I remember when Dawn was first published, there was a letter included from the V.C. Andrews family in the foreword to the book, where they finally acknowledged that these books were ghost written. Now, at this point in time, Andrew Niederman has written over 70 under the name V.C. Andrews. He's essentially cranked out multiple books a year. He started many original series of his own under her name and has also gone back and written prequels and companion books. I didn't read any of them past the Dawn book, just from looking at the covers and sort of getting a feel for the direction that they were going in. Over time, they seem to become increasingly more youth-oriented, probably young adult appropriate, and probably not bearing a huge resemblance to the original V.C. Andrews. But obviously they continue to find an audience, and in that respect, that's a very strong compliment to the legacy of V.C. Andrews. Well, I loved doing this video because as an adult, I could appreciate so much more just like how crazy they were. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have thoughts or memories or recollections on V.C. Andrews, please drop them in the comments. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I will see you next time. Take care.
It doesn't have to end here. Click on one of the videos below for Elvis and more, and we'd love to have you like, share, and subscribe, and maybe even join so we can put some more gas in this thing.